In this video, we're going to start to take a look at forms in HTML5. Create a form using the form element, denoted by the opening and closing form tags. Inside the form, we have things called inputs, and these inputs have a type. The most common input type is text, which will allow the user to essentially just enter in some text. Close an input just like that in HTML5. We also have an input of type password that is very common. And as you can guess, the user can then enter in a password. We also have an input of type submit. And this is important as it renders a button and allows the user to click on the button to submit the form. We also need to pass in a couple of attributes to the opening form tag. One of these attributes is the action. And the value that we put into the action attribute is where the form will actually be sent to. So that'll be generally dealt with some server-side processing. As this is not a server-side processing video, we're going to go ahead and leave the action attribute blank. But please note that this will show an error in the online validator by leaving the action attribute blank. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to go ahead and leave it blank. We also have a method. The method attribute will take a value of either post or get. For the purpose of this video, we're going to take a look at using the get method and forming a query string. We'll take a look at the query string in just a moment. It's very important to remember that we would never use the get method to submit any type of sensitive data. To form the actual query string, we need to pass in a name attribute. And for this input, I'm just going to type in username as the name. And for this one, I'm going to type in password. So let's go ahead and save this and take a look in the browser. As you can see, we have some form of bare form. This would be the input of type text, this would be the input of type password, and this is our input of type submit. You can see this button. By default, the word submit will be printed on this button. But we can change that and we'll have a look at that in just a moment. So I'm just going to enter in some information. I'm going to use my name and a password of password and click submit. As you can see, we have some data appended to our URL in the address bar. This is a query string. This starts with the question mark. So username refers to the name attribute I've given to the first input, and the value of that is what I've typed into the input. Then an ampersand, and then the password, which is actually the name attribute I specified for this second field, which is a password field. And the value for that I've entered in password. So as you can see, when I enter in text into the password field, it actually renders as little dots. It's important to remember that this is only a masking mechanism. As you can see, the password has been submitted in plain text. So let's take a look at adding some extra things to this form. We'll start off by changing the text rendered on the submit button. We use this with the value attribute. Submit the form will now be rendered on that button rather than the standard default of submit. Just take a quick look at this in the browser. And now we have submit the form rendered on the button. Right, so now let's take a look at field sets. A field set is used to group related inputs. It's denoted by the opening and closing field set tags. Just going to cut this closing field set tag and put it down the bottom just before our closing form tag. Then indent our inputs as per good coding practice. So now that we have a field set, we can actually add in a legend, which is denoted by the opening and closing legend tags. And here we can enter in some text that will be rendered above the form as a type of caption. Let's go ahead and save this. Just take a look in the browser and see what this actually looks like now. As you can see, we now have some kind of border surrounding our form and a caption that's kind of embedded in this border. So now let's make our form a little bit nicer by adding in some labels. Labels are denoted by the opening and closing label tag, and the label takes a for attribute, and this for attribute must match an ID of the input that we are using the label for. This will make more sense in just a moment. So for the for attribute of this label, I'm going to type in username, then I'm going to add an ID to this input of username. So this label will be for the input with an ID of username. Then we can enter in some text in between the opening and closing label tags. I'm going to go ahead and do the same for the password. Using the for attribute, then making sure we add an ID of password to match the for attribute of that label. So essentially what a label will do is we can click on the label and focus will be brought to the input that the label is for. So let's save this and take a look in the browser. As you can see, we now have some text just before our inputs. So if I go ahead and click on username, focus will be brought to that text field, and same for password. So now, as of HTML5, we can actually use a placeholder attribute as well. And this is actually quite nice. Looks just like that. We can enter in some text into the placeholder that'll be rendered in that input by default. It may help a user understand what that input is actually for. So I'm just going to go ahead and enter in username. And go ahead and do the same for the password. We're typing in password. So let's save this, take a look in the browser and see how this looks. As you can see, we have some kind of grayed out text in the actual input. It's actually quite a nice feature of HTML5. When we click on that, we can now enter in our data and submit the form, and just as we had before, we have our query string. So this is just adding some nice features to our form without affecting the actual functionality of the form. We also have an input of type reset. As you may have guessed, this will allow us, or the user, to click on this button and it will actually clear the form inputs. We can also pass in a value here to change the default text, which would just be reset. We can do clear the form. Let's save this, take another look in the browser. As you can see, we now have an extra button. So let's try this out. Clear the form, and the form has been cleared. So I hope you've learned a little bit about using forms in HTML5, the field set, legend, basic input types, and labels.